The security dilemma is a concept that emerges strongly during the Cold War and continues to become more contextualized and layered as we move into the contemporary period. Traditional ideas of security in IR revolve around the state's survival as a particular type of political community. Security in these terms was usually linked to military defense of states against external threats, and that led to a preoccupation with states and the strategy of war. The overriding security concerns of the 20th century were focused on the possibility of nuclear confrontation between superpowers, which had the potential to kill millions in the short run while making the planet uninhabitable in the long term. Strategic aspects of security studies were given more weight by scholars during this period, and new concerns like environmental change began to be introduced during that time, and these remain important political issues to this day. Liberalism provided a critique of these security approaches, and new approaches have also gained in popularity, especially constructivism, but also critical theory, feminism, postmodernism, colonialism, and green political thought. These areas highlight the limitations of conventional thinking, i.e., the debate between liberalism and realism, as well as the fact that the state itself is a source of insecurity for some populations. An example of this would be Syria in the contemporary period. These developments have created a shift in focus from the state to people as the principal concerns of security. Studies now consist of human security concerns that draw from the terror wars and environmental concerns. So classical realism was founded on these pessimistic assumptions of human nature that were based on humans being fearful and self-regarding in their social relations. And these assumptions fed the theory of power politics and the idea behind the struggle for survival in an anarchic world. In addition to balance of power ideas that emerged during the Cold War, many realists centered research on the security dilemma, something that emerges from the fact that individuals or groups concerned about attacks from others strive to attain security by acquiring more and more power, but this makes others in the system more insecure and compels them to acquire more and more power. The dilemma arises when the action of one state enhancing its military capacity causes other state to feel threatened or less secure. Even if its actions are defensive, it may not be viewed that way by its peers. There are ways to contain this dilemma, like the liberal approach recommends through cooperative security regimes, but neo-realists do not believe such solutions can be permanent and that periods of absence of conflict are the best possible outcome due to the anarchic environment of IR. A world at peace is only so temporarily, according to neo-realists. With the collapse of the Soviet Union in the late 20th century, the structural conditions of bipolarity supporting the balance of power theory gave way to American hegemony. This is a position of dominance in the world system. Arguably, this created anti-Western sentiment that impacted relations in the developing countries. This was much more muted during the Cold War. These responses today include violent displays by fundamentalist movements. Some realists have softened their view of anarchy, arguing that security cooperation among states can result in a condition they call mature anarchy, where states act on the realization that their security objectives are best achieved by abandoning narrow self-interest and taking account of the security interests of other states. Thus, security communities like the EU may emerge. But theories related to security communities are usually the domain of liberal scholars, and the end of the Cold War presented a wealth of new opportunities for international cooperation, requiring the exercise of political will among key players to bring about a new world order in which widespread peace and security could be striven toward. The basis for this scenario was provided by international institutions aiming at solving the anarchy problem, largely through collective security. Liberal institutionalists accept aspects of realism like anarchy, but they believe the condition can be controlled by a durable network of international institutions underpinned by strongly supported norms and rules. This is the liberal concept of managed anarchy. The remainder of this chapter, which we cover in part in the next week, revisits the idea of critical approaches and the relevance of the contemporary international environment for those approaches. Beginning with constructivism, views of reality that realists subscribe to are challenged by an argument that the world is constructed by a complex of intersubjective understandings emerging from social relations. The condition of anarchy is then what states make of it, and anarchy is not automatic, existing without something to support it. This means that the security dilemma does not exist prior to any interaction between states, but is in fact a product of the social interaction between states. This supports the liberal claim that institutions can be devised to transform state interests and identities that create conditions more conducive to peace and security. Constructivist theory also addressed the idea of security communities and promoted the idea that shared understandings, norms, and values among states can foster such community. But constructivists do not limit that community to democracies like democratic peace theory. Global politics is essentially social, not asocial, as depicted by realists, and thus identities of states and sources of state interests are important for understanding power dynamics, and they may be changeable and or changing according to constructivist thought. One security question that has become important is communication technology and the massive innovations that have occurred since the 1970s. Research on the impact of machination began with an eye to understanding how machines impacted psychological states of individuals and populations, and it evolved to encapsulate artificial intelligence and other technical solutions to modern problems, as well as science fiction-inspired fears of attack of artificial intelligence. The problem of cyber threat fits into our discussion because it engages non-state and state actors, and so the widened view of IR is appropriate, but it also impacts some strategic and relevant sites like power grids, missile systems, information about populations, and information about government plans. Cyber attacks could theoretically replace the need to launch bombs if power grids can be decommissioned with the simple hacking of a system. Related to that, I encourage you to watch this John Oliver report as it discusses the tech used to keep nuclear weapons in the United States safe. The question of cybersecurity is informed partially by constructivist concerns, because as a contemporary condition of international relations, most of the problems that emerge around cyber relations involve non-state actors, and they also relate to both material realism circumstances, but also conjure constructivist questions, since how we view and understand an issue impacts the steps taken or not taken to prevent new forms of security threats. In other words, how we frame issues has consequences for how we solve them. From the standpoint of the authors in the article assigned called The Information Revolution, Security, and International Relations, they identify the fact that there has been less theorizing about innovations in IT, as most research has been situated around policy or IT specialist-specific questions. Therefore, they attempt to provide some theoretical foundation for ways to view the ways that three different theories, realism, constructivism, and liberalism, have or have not confronted the question of cybersecurity. They start out by distinguishing between traditionalists and Widener's in the approach to cybersecurity and its perceptions. Traditionalists are generally realists and also state-centric, and they're interested mostly in military strategic studies, and they maintain that despite the emergence of ethnic and religious insurgents, global terrorism, transnational crime, and global warming, there is no need to broaden the definition of security. Traditionalists continue to approach security from the viewpoint of the nation-state and interstate war. Wideners, on the other hand, represent a mix of liberals and critical theorists who claim that the security concept should be broadened to encompass new threats and challenges, spanning political, societal, economic, and environmental sectors. Wideners incorporate a range of new actors in their analyses, notably non-governmental organizations, social movements, terrorist organizations, private firms, and individuals. This last part of the lecture on security asks you to consider some of the monumental moments of cybersecurity. You may have to do some research and ask yourself which perspective is best for analyzing that situation. For example, when the North Korean hackers hacked Sony in 2014 and demanded that the movie The Interview not be released, which major perspectives were in play? On one hand, there was likely state involvement in this action, although it is unconfirmed. However, the targets were an international firm instead of another state. In addition, the reason for the demand to remove the film was due to the disrespectful way that Kim Jong-un was portrayed in the film, a vision that might severely impact his image at home, where Koreans are not allowed to criticize their leader for threat of imprisonment. In recent years, more and more USBs with American movies have found their way into North Korean hands, and this incites fear among those authorities that rebellion could be fostered through North American messages. I've listed an additional article here from Reuters about an Iranian hacking accusation by the part of the United States as another example of ways that cybersecurity and cyber threats shape interactions between states and have legitimate consequences.